Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for this ITIF event on the way forward for U.S. spectrum policy. My name is Joe Kane, and I'm the Director of Broadband and Spectrum Policy here at ITIF. We all depend on spectrum every day, and the number and diversity of commercial wireless technologies are expanding rapidly. From your smartphone to home internet connections, to factories and ports and the Internet of Things, all kinds of connectivity increasingly include wireless. So as wireless applications become more valuable, it becomes even more important that we have spectrum policies that maximize the productivity of our airwaves. In particular, we need a balance between federal spectrum holdings and spectrum available to commercial users. To that end, the federal government has rolled out a national spectrum strategy that aims to make some federal spectrum available for commercial use and make reforms to federal spectrum allocation processes and spectrum research and development. Last week, NTIA released the implementation plan that aims to put theory to practice in realizing the goals of the National Spectrum Strategy. The implementation plan is a detailed document with lots of moving parts, but those details will be very consequential to the future of the wireless ecosystem. So that's why we have leaders and experts in the field to discuss all of this, and maybe more, at today's event. Up first, we're privileged to have some opening remarks by Representative Doris Matsui, who is one of the few people on Capitol Hill who understands the complex dynamics of spectrum policy and consistently engages with them. She is a real leader on this subject and will certainly be an integral part of ensuring the national spectrum strategy plays out for the benefit of American economic and national security. Over to you, Congresswoman Matsui.
Hello to everyone attending today's panel on the way forward for U.S. spectrum policy. While I'd rather be with you in person today, there are just a few things going on in Congress keeping us busy. I want to thank ITIF for hosting this very important event. During my time in Congress, and especially as ranking member of the Communications and Technology Subcommittee, this issue has been one of my top priorities. That's because few issues have more bearing on American innovation and national security than spectrum governance. The global race to 5 and 6G is still white hot. Satellite broadband service is taking off, and Wi-Fi continues to create massive opportunities for Americans. To stay ahead of our peers, the federal government must be a driving force in maintaining a healthy spectrum pipeline. For that to happen, it needs to speak with one voice. In my first letter to then President-elect Biden, I called on the administration to develop a unified approach to spectrum governance and a well-understood process for resolving disputes. As I noted in the letter, more intensive use of spectrum has the potential to cause friction among federal agencies and commercial users. To some extent, this is unavoidable and healthy. Thoughtful debate about how to best utilize our limited spectrum resources will lead to better outcomes and more efficiency. But what can start as a collaboration can quickly turn to conflict. When disagreements arise, it's vital that all agencies are aware of administration policy and understand how to provide feedback in a constructive manner. Because when this process breaks down or doesn't exist, we end up where we find ourselves today. Under a year-long lapse in the FCC's auction authority, the consequences of this lapse hold the potential to be severe and far-reaching. It undercuts economic growth and long-term national security. I'm working with other leaders in Congress to find a consensus path forward. For our economy and standing on the world stage, this issue cannot wait. But it's not all about doom and gloom and spectrum. I can't think of a better response to my letter than the National Spectrum Strategy and the Presidential Memorandum. Taken together, these two documents represent a vital investment in American leadership. If the strategy is the roadmap, then the Presidential Memorandum is the car's user manual. The strategy shows us where we're going, and the memorandum tells us how we'll get there. We need both. But these documents alone won't get us where we need to be. It'll take all of us working together to ensure we hit our implementation goals. Now that's why I recently led a letter with my Republican counterpart, Chairman Lauda, requesting information from NTIA and DoD about their plans for the study of the lower 3 gigahertz band. While important work was done through the Embers report, the studies under the national security will ensure this spectrum is used as efficiently as possible while protecting vital federal missions. We need both agencies collaborating with industry partners to follow the engineering. This isn't just good spectrum policy. It's consistent with President Biden's commitment to evidence-based decisions rooted in science. And with the recent release of the implementation plan, I'm confident we're headed in the right direction. But clearly, our work isn't over. That's why I'm so glad panels like this one are continuing to move us forward. It's your expertise that will help us chart a path forward on spectrum policy. So please, stay in touch and share your ideas. We need them in Congress now more than ever. With that, I want to thank ITIF for the invitation to speak with you, and I hope you enjoy the panel. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Representative Matsui. We look forward to working with you as you go throughout this process. And now we're going to turn to our all-star panel of experts who bring perspectives that run the gamut of wireless technologies and applications of today and into the future. Their full bios are on our website, so I'm just going to very briefly introduce them now, and then we'll dive in. First up is Jamie Eort, who is Head of Wireless and Spectrum Policy for Amazon. Next is Umair Javed, Senior Vice President for Spectrum at CTIA. And last but not least is Becky Tangren, Vice President and Associate General Counsel for NCTA, the Internet and Television Association. Thank you all for being here. Before we start, I want to tell the audience if our panelists have agreed to take some questions. So if you have questions, you can submit them using the Slido link that's on both the event page on our website and in the video description if you're on YouTube. We'll try to leave some time at the end to answer as many of those as we can. So just to get started, before we get into the nitty-gritty of the implementation plan itself, I want to see if I can get the panelists' thoughts on what we're doing here. What are we trying to do? What is the point of the National Spectrum Strategy, or what should it be? Umair, do you want to start with that one?
Sure, happy to do it. Thanks, Joe. It's great to be here. The United States led the world in wireless for the last decade, and that's true for both our military and our commercial sector. The purpose of a national spectrum strategy, I think, should be to extend that leadership into the next decade. I think a strategy can do that by leveraging and expanding our national strengths and our competitive advantages. We are undoubtedly the most innovative economy in the world, and an estimated 70% of new value that's going to be created over the next decade will be based on digitally enabled platforms and business models. And so a spectrum strategy should be a strategy to lead in that economy, because when we do that, we advance U.S. interests, we constrain our adversaries, especially China, and we strengthen our national security as well. So those strengths, those competitive advantages, I think they include our spectrum auction program that is built on free market principles. I think it includes the innovative capacity of our world-class wireless networks, and it includes our ability to work with our allies and our partners to build and scale a global, a harmonized and a secure wireless ecosystem. Those are really our competitive advantages. That's what helps us succeed. And so I think a goal of a spectrum strategy should be to leverage those strengths into the next decade as well.
Yeah, thanks. Becky, do you want to go next on that?
Sure. Yes, I agree with a lot of what Umair said. We certainly are leaders in innovation and technology and wireless communications. And the reason why America is a leader in that sector is because we have a economy and a policy regime that allows for participation from multiple stakeholders and multiple purposes. So on its face, I think we all know the National Spectrum Strategy is attempting to make sure we can use spectrum most efficiently, and has teed up pipelines, and also has a long-term plan for addressing some of those issues. But as we go through this process, the goal should be to make sure that it's done in a transparent way and that allows the voice of multiple stakeholders, whether that's from the commercial sector or from our federal agencies. I mean, often spectrum policy has been decided in a siloed manner, and the strategy really works to bring all those users together in one place and make decisions together.
Yeah, Jamie, do you have thoughts on that?
Yes, thanks, Joe, and thanks for having me today. It's certainly an exciting time to be working in spectrum policy, and of course, always an exciting time to be at Amazon. I would just flag from the outset that of course, at Amazon, almost everything we do for customers is built on connectivity, including, of course, all the wireless technologies enabled by spectrum policy. I think we're pretty unique in terms of a user of spectrum, not only as a business, but of course for our customers, and have multiple different uses, including, of course, our satellite broadband project, all the devices and services that rely on and improve connectivity in the home, especially like Wi-Fi and other technologies that run over unlicensed. Of course, we have AWS that offers private 5G services for enterprises, and of course, also wireless carriers. These are just a few of our use cases. And so, and part of the reason why this national spectrum strategy, I think, is so important. So I agree with a lot of what both Becky and Umair said. The national spectrum strategy is a really important step towards making sure that, consumers, innovators, industries, and of course, national security interests all have access to the spectrum needed. As Becky and Umair both mentioned, both economic and national security depend on this valuable public resource being managed as efficiently and effectively as possible. I think the goal of the strategy is to make sure that they do that, and that all users, and a wide variety of users, as Becky mentioned, have access to this important resource.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a really good to get sort of the background there on what we're trying to do here. Another sort of table setting question I wanted to start us off with is, before we get into like individual bands and things, it seems as though all the bands in the national spectrum strategy involve getting a little bit of capacity from the federal government, taking spectrum from the federal government and using it for commercial uses in some way, shape, or form we can talk about later. But I wonder if any of you could comment on just like why we're doing that. Is there a reason to think the federal government is maybe not being the most efficient or effective in its management of spectrum now, and there's good reason to maybe reshuffle it a little bit?
Sure. Yeah, I'm happy to start, Joe. Obviously, everyone wants to use spectrum. I mean, we can just see it in our everyday lives. Our the consumers' homes are all basically wireless. Most of us have video surveillance, whatever you have, your Ring doorbell, your refrigerator, and then also at work, you get to work, you get on your Wi-Fi, as Jamie mentioned. Amazon's using it in multiple facets of its business, but also the biggest user of spectrum in the United States is the federal government, and they have many national security interests that are important to making those same consumers and businesses feel safe on a day-to-day basis. So it's not that I don't view it as trying to get capacity away. I view it as we need a path to make sure all those interests can be served, and it doesn't have to be a give or take necessarily. And at NCTA, we think there is a path forward to do this through coexistence frameworks, like unlicensed or the sharing regime in the CBRS band. And there is a way we can serve all these multiple interests without looking at it as you take from one person and give to another.
Yeah, I think just to build on that a little bit, I think the short answer from our perspective is we're trying to get capacity from the federal government because we need more spectrum to meet commercial demand. And the federal government, with its vast holdings of bandwidth, is the richest source, especially in the mid-band. if you look at U.S. mobile wireless traffic, it grew by more than 40% last year alone. That was a record. Consumers and businesses are simply just using more devices and more data every year. That usage is going to continue to grow in the years ahead. And that means American wireless networks are carrying record amounts of traffic every single year. Now, licensed users are always increasing their efficiency in how they're using spectrum to help keep up with that demand. And they're spurred in part by market incentives to do that, right? To put that spectrum to use. But there was a study from the Brattle Group a couple of years ago that found that this rapid growth in wireless use can't be met with existing spectrum access alone. And so we look to the federal government because there seems to be capacity there, but not the market incentive to capture it necessarily. And one thing that I come back to is a couple of years ago, NTIA did these studies. They looked at how some federal spectrum bands were being used in certain markets in the country. They did drive tests, they did fixed tests, and they produced these waterfall charts that sort of showed how federal government spectrum was used. And what you saw there was that federal users use spectrum much differently than commercial users. Their use generally is a lot more sporadic. And that's not to say the use isn't important. It just means that that's the nature of the use. Meanwhile, if you compare that waterfall chart to, for example, a waterfall chart of licensed spectrum, you'll see much more ubiquitous use in that spectrum. And so that's why there's this idea that there seems to be capacity on the federal side. And is there a way to capture that without interfering with or without affecting or degrading federal capability? I think that, as it stands, there is sort of an unbalance in U.S. spectrum policy today, especially in that critical mid-band range. When we look at that, the bands of spectrum that can be used for 5G, what we see is that the government controls about 600% more of that spectrum than licensed spectrum. And so I think it is important to look at how we can be more balanced without sacrificing those federal capabilities. And we have a long history of doing that.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Jamie? Yeah.
Yeah, I think I would just add that, as technology advances and new and innovative spectrum sharing technologies are developed, it's important to regularly evaluate the use of this valuable national asset. And of course, while the national spectrum strategy is focusing on federal spectrum because of many of the points, Becky and Umair both made, it's important that we're evaluating, all spectrum essentially. So especially as technology advances, with new coexistence frameworks, as Becky mentioned, it's not necessarily about taking from one user and reallocating it to another. It's about how this valuable, how to expand access to this valuable resource in a way that works for a variety of users and use cases, including, many of our interests on this panel. So I think, we're seeing how these frameworks maximize the use of spectrum and allow, multiple commercial users as well as both commercial and national security users in the same band. And so that's not to say we shouldn't also be looking at where it's possible to reallocate, but I think, certainly some of these newer frameworks are able to expand access in ways that, maybe weren't contemplated, over a decade ago.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you. So let's sort of start working into how we're going to do all of this. And so the NTIA's plan for that is the implementation plan, which came out a little over a week ago now. And so just to get started, I think, does anyone have just their first impressions of the implementation plan? How are you feeling based on, we had the strategy come out in November, implementation plan is out now. Are you feeling more optimistic, less optimistic? And then we'll get into sort of the components of it later.
Happy to start. I think the implementation plan is another very important step in this overall process. As we all know, not much gets done in Washington without deadlines. So of course, I appreciate that it does lay out a roadmap with concrete steps and some deadlines. I think it's helpful that it identifies all the right stakeholders, including, the various responsible federal agencies and of course the public. Overall, the technical studies with these deadlines, of course, are an important element needed for progress to be made. It's good that this is the living document, that the plan acknowledges that this is a living document, which is a recognition, of course, that this strategy does need to be evaluated and updated continuously. Like I mentioned before, particularly as technology advances, we are certainly ready to be active and helpful participants in these studies and the process.
It's certainly a lot to take in, the implementation plan. There's a lot in there. There are 36 outcomes that the federal government will pursue with very specific timelines and responsible agencies. So it's a lot to digest. Let me start with the good, at least from my perspective. I think there's recognition of important commercial wireless interests in the implementation plan. I think the plan makes clear that NTIA will co-lead spectrum studies, and it explains what that actually means, what it means to co-lead. I think that's great. I think that's just good policy. I think it is table stakes, really, to put trust back into the process of spectrum decision making. So I was very happy to see that. I think the implementation plan also ensures a restudy of the lower 3 gigahertz band and a new study of 7 and 8 gigahertz band. So it starts to set the foundation for a pipeline that can serve commercial needs. The implementation plan also says that we're not going to prejudge these studies. We're going to look at all options for commercial access. And again, I think that's table stakes for putting trust back into that decision-making process. I do think that the implementation plan is very focused on managing innovation in a way that is new, and doing so without the benefit necessarily of the strategic context or the goal of what we're all working towards. And ultimately, I think that we can supercharge the implementation plan by providing a little more confidence that all this work that we're going to undertake over the next few years is going to produce actionable outcomes. And there are 3 things that I sort of zoom in on when thinking about that. The first is that we could ensure that spectrum studies are serving a higher purpose. Right now, a lot of the focus is on process, it's not on outcomes. But I think if we're to have a national spectrum strategy, we should have the courage to aim high. We shouldn't just codify best practices instead of looking beyond them. And whether that comes from the administration or from Congress or the agencies themselves, I think we need some of that strategic context about what we want to achieve and where we want to be 2 years from now. And I think benchmarks about how much spectrum we want to clear would do that. And it would be consistent with how past administrations have planned their spectrum strategies and how Congress has passed spectrum legislation before. I think the second thing is that we could do more to reduce the pull of the past and depoliticize decision-making. There's some language in the implementation plan about developing a values-based model to aid future spectrum decision-making. And it's not really clear, to me at least, what that entails at this stage. But I do fear that some could interpret that to be a retreat from market-based principles that have been used to make the US really the leader in wireless over the past decade. So how does that values-based methodology intersect with sort of the market-based principles that we've adopted, that the rest of the world has followed, and that has been hugely successful for us? Just looking at it, I worry it sounds sort of like going back to beauty contests and outcome-driven policy that we had in the past. And the third thing is I think we could do a little more to create a democracy of information. I think the strategy does a great job addressing the fact that there are really inadequate and incomplete records at federal agencies about how they use the spectrum and about what their spectrum needs are. I think the strategy does a great job of trying to fill that gap and address that. It'll make assessing, I think, commercial opportunities in these bands easier. But those initiatives, none of them seem to consider creating more transparency for the private sector. A lot of that work is focused within the interagency, and it's not clear yet how much of that is going to involve the private sector or what transparency we'll have. And that does seem like a little bit of a gap to me.
So I agree with a lot of Jamie and Umair's impressions. I think where I differ from Umair is that I see some of those things you mentioned as a good thing. I think it is good that we are moving forward with an evidence-based and technical-based approach to looking at how to make spectrum policy decisions. I agree we should have lofty goals in this country, but we also are running out of spectrum, and we need to make these decisions in a way that is technically sound. And yes, it may differ from the way we've done it in the past, but I think that's a good thing, because the way we've done it in the past is what has gotten us into this situation. And as far as creating a value-based model, there are a lot of interests in our country that go beyond typical economics or how much you can raise at auction. And, it is a hard exercise, but I think that we have all the right minds in place to do that exercise and take into account more than simple math and look at what else do we want to achieve as a country in terms of what we stand for: competition, reaching tribal lands, reaching rural areas, all of those things that we value as a society.
No, I think that's all really interesting. I think some of the things that stuck out from that are both the timelines on how we're going to proceed with this, and then these studies, which I think a lot is going to depend upon. So I want to, next to broad areas about those, let's start with the timelines quickly. Obviously, as Umair and I think Jamie mentioned, that agencies are going to be working with NTIA. Agencies, that use a ban will work with NTIA in examining the ban. How confident are you that agencies are going to meet the deadlines in the National Spectrum Strategy? And do you think that that's quick enough? And in general, like as we're looking ahead towards when consumers can realize the benefits of actually getting this spectrum into commercial use, how long is that going to take?
Yeah. Well, first I agree with Jamie that I think the timeline is a real strength in this implementation plan. And first, let me take one step back from there even and just credit to this administration and to the agencies already for meeting the timelines that have already been met. I think that is a huge accomplishment in itself. The implementation plan was produced in 3 or 4 months after the release of the National Spectrum Strategy. And that certainly gives me optimism about ability to keep to the timing. The timing is really important. What I like about the strategy is there is this really detailed timeline. It's effectively a scorecard for accountability, right? You can even take the appendix and just check off the dates as we get to them and hold this government, this administration accountable to their plan. I think that's a huge strength of this plan. I think that some things to consider is that there is a lot of new work in this implementation plan connected to very aggressive timelines. Many of the 36 initiatives are in their infancy at this point. I note that NTIA tasks itself with 32 of the 36 initiatives in this document. I think it's reasonable to ask whether the resources are there to manage all that work and meet the NSS objectives in the timelines that are in the document. I think that the other thing that struck me about the implementation plan was that there was not much discussion of international processes, and that's been a big part of spectrum policy in the United States. The World Radio Communication Conference, for example, has been a huge flashpoint for spectrum policy every 4 years. And when I look at this document, one thing I see is that the domestic timelines, there isn't much consideration about how they align with international timelines, right? And an example of this is the 7 and 8 gigahertz band, where the ITU process to study that band is already underway. We certainly view that band as an opportunity for the US to lead in the development of a new global 5G band. But under the implementation plan, the federal government won't complete its domestic study until November 2026. And the next World Radio Communication Conference is scheduled for 2027. And so it's unclear whether how the US, or when the US is going to be able to inform the international studies or take an international position on that band in advance of the World Radio Communication Conference. And my fear is that we'll see a similar dynamic to what we saw in 2024, which was lack of a domestic consensus, sidelining the US potentially in international discussions, or late proposals to the conference, or the lack of a real positive agenda of where we want spectrum policy to go. So that's one dynamic that I think hopefully will be flushed out as we go forward. I also think there's a little bit of a lack of urgency in starting the spectrum studies. Under the timeline, I think the agencies don't start planning those studies for another 8 months. The plan calls for the creation of new cooperative processes, but those aren't expected until September 2026. And so, again, how do all these things line up is a question that I have. And the final thing I'll say is that I do work, while a lot of these initiatives, I think Becky is right, a lot of these initiatives are very good and will be helpful for spectrum policy. I hope that they don't become reasons for delay, that when the FCC or others try to engage on spectrum policy, that the answer is, well, we haven't codified that best practice yet, or we haven't finished this look at federal use, and so we can't engage you on that. And so that's the other, I think, thing on my mind, at least.
Yeah, I would just build on that a little bit. Of course, we're hopeful that these timelines will be met, and agree with you, Mayor, that already there's a good track record there in terms of, getting the implementation plan out and having, this roadmap. Ultimately, it's important to have an open and transparent process with as much speed as possible. The outcome of this very important technical work will directly impact, America's global competitiveness and national security. And I think Umair raises a good point in terms of some of the international work that will be happening in parallel. And that, should certainly be taken into account. And, obviously, as we prepare for WRC 27, there will be studies and things that can also be helpful in this process. So I think, it's important to get it done as quickly as possible, but it's obviously also important to get it right. I think ultimately, if this process is done well, and it has, all the right stakeholders, and, I think we're in a good position so far on that, it should help on the back end in making additional spectrum available for commercial use, quicker, right? So if you're doing a lot of this work on the front end, the technical work, getting the right engineers in the room and figuring out what's possible and what would work, best in particular bands, I think that work is also important. And if it's done on the front end, it should make things go more quickly on the back end.
Yeah, I mean, I have full faith and confidence in our hardworking federal government employees to meet the timelines. And I know the folks at NTIA, FCC, OSTP, ITS, all the federal agencies will work very hard. Of course, nothing's ever fast enough. That's the world we live in today, but we can't afford to get this wrong. And I have certainly seen cases where I don't want to specify a specific agency or spectrum band, but the cases where maybe the decision has got ahead of some of the technical work, and so then there have been delays on the back end, and it might look to the public like a decision was made, but then some things weren't fully thought through, so it's still delaying getting those services out. So you could look at it as if the work is put in now, that it will prevent those sort of delays after the decisions are made. I do think there are some opportunities in some of the specific bands where we could move a little faster. In 3.1, there was already a lot of work put into studying this band through the PATHS process, and it may not have had the political outcome that everyone agreed with, but I do think there's some sound technical work there that hopefully will be built upon, and we're not starting over from scratch. Also in the 7 and 8 gigahertz band, I mean, that's a lot of spectrum. It's like 1,300 megahertz of spectrum. And so there are different uses throughout that band. And I think some parts of the band may be more ripe for commercial service than others. For example, the lower portion of the band has, from what we can tell, less complicated incumbencies, and it's located right above the existing 6 gigahertz band that's allocated for unlicensed. So it seems like a natural place that maybe we could do some coexistence studies there, show that unlicensed would not cause interference with the federal incumbents, and get that Wi-Fi into the hands of consumers more quickly.
Okay, yeah, that's really interesting. And I think I want to drill down a little more on those studies, because that's always the work that everyone's doing along this timeline. A lot of it is, doing studies. So I wonder if you guys could share what's your understanding of just what do we mean when we say, oh, go study that? What are they studying? What alternatives should they be studying? And what are sort of the trade-offs that are being evaluated there? I don't know, Becky, if you want to pick up there. You were talking about some studies to begin with.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think what we're studying is how can we maximize the utility of a spectrum band, and we don't necessarily have a predetermined outcome that stems from the strategy or the implementation plan. I mean, I think NTIA has been very clear. We recognize the role of the FCC, and they make the allocation decisions and set the service rules. So I think what NTIA's study should do is look at all the potential options. So we need information from the federal agencies about how they're using the spectrum, at what power levels, at what locations, what time, because some of these uses are time-based, like military radars. And then the folks who are interested in incoming commercial services can provide their inputs and their power levels and where they plan to deploy, and some really detailed nuances, but like propagation models, and are you going to deploy below the clutter or above the clutter, and things of that nature. And we can do that through propagation analysis. We can do that through probability analysis. That can be done through actual field tests on the ground, hopefully using ITS facilities and existing DoD facilities, and the implementation plan does call for all of that.
Okay. Yeah, Umair, you go next.
Jamie, you want to go?
Oh, Jamie, go ahead.
Sure. I'll go quickly. Yeah, I think as I've already said, it's important to just regularly evaluate and study this. And I think as part of these studies, they have identified, I think, a lot of stakeholders. For example, NTIA is of course committed to robust public participation, which I think is really important in this as well. In addition to everything Becky, of course, already mentioned. And I would just say, like, after having done spectrum policy in DC for quite a while now. I won't date myself, but it's definitely approaching 2 decades. I think I typically have a lot of faith in engineers. And I think if we can get the engineers like in the room and the right incentives are there, and, they're going to find a way. I see that, not only at my own company, but of course in these spectrum policy debates over the last, couple decades. I think, they have the right process. This is the right process. Let's get this important technical work. Let's get the right people in the room, and then let's figure out how best to move forward for all these important reasons, including, of course, our competitiveness and innovation and all these things.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. It's funny, when I was at the FCC, I sort of had this view that spectrum studies sometimes were like Rorschach tests. Everyone saw what they wanted to see in them. Same study, and just 2 completely different conclusions depending on who you were talking to. What I really admired was the ability of the FCC engineers to dig into these studies, understand the assumptions that went into them, understand the modeling that was used for them, and come up with next steps. With what can we reasonably and really take away from this study that should inform spectrum policy. So completely agree with Jamie that getting the engineers in the room, letting them do the work, is hugely important. I think that the trend leading up to the National Spectrum Strategy, at least, was that in a lot of the interagency discussions, what we saw was other federal agencies taking the view that the FCC shouldn't really have that role. That when they do a spectrum study, the FCC shouldn't be allowed to look under the hood and say, and test your assumptions and test your methodologies and push back and say, well, what if we did this, or what if we did that? They sort of had this idea of, we did a study and now that's what you have to act on as it is. What we saw was in some of those, Becky mentioned proceedings where it seemed like there was a decision, and then other studies came in or other agencies came in that might have thrown that into some disarray. What we saw is, agencies would come and put a study on the table and say, this study shows you can't do anything. Sometimes with a timing associated with 10 years, a moratorium on a 5G build, for example, can't do anything. Get the engineers in the room, let them do their work, and suddenly you'd have 5G service launched commercially nationwide within 8 to 10 weeks. And it just shows the importance of allowing the engineers to actually do the work and ensure that there's good studies being performed. The implementation plan does a great job of recognizing that and saying that we're going to codify some of that and make sure that when spectrum studies are done, federal agencies are going to NTIA and working with them, that when they're doing modeling, it's based on real world assumptions. And so I hope that we see better studies, we see good studies that we can all coalesce around going forward as well. The fear always in Washington, D.C. too, is that study sometimes is just another word for delay. And I think it is sometimes hard to differentiate between when study is real and when it is just a tactic to not make progress. And so I think being able to differentiate between those 2 things is very important. I think the last thing I'll say is that another trend I've seen in spectrum studies is that they are crossing that line, but that separates the technical from the policy. And more what we're seeing is at the spectrum study phase, they're making policy decisions that really should be the ambit of the FCC or NTIA or others. And, PATS is a good example of this, where, what Becky described was people unhappy with a political outcome at the end of the study. And I don't think that's it at all. I think really what people reacted to in the PATS process was the political gamesmanship at the beginning of the study. The fact that use cases, studies, things we've done in the past were arbitrarily left out of the scope of the study to begin with. I think that's where people had issue with the PATS process. Going forward, I think we all should share in the direction of setting the direction of these studies. We should share in that work. So we don't have situations like that where an incumbent or a single user arbitrarily limits the scope of the study and says, we're not even going to look at these options. Because when you get to the end of that process, one, there's just not credibility, there's not trust in the study that's produced. And two, important options were never studied to begin with. And now what the implementation plan is doing is setting us back 2 years and saying, well, now we're going to go back and restudy those options, but we could have saved those 2 years, I think, to begin with.
Yeah, I think interesting points all around there. I kind of want to move us on the, staying within studies, but also we're allowed to trespass into the policy realm and ask a little bit about, one of the big topics here is sharing versus clearing spectrum. And so one of the things we're studying often is, can a federal incumbent be moved out of a band entirely? Can we share based on time, based on location, or some sort of dynamic sharing framework? And I know, I think especially NCTA and CTIA have different views on this. And so maybe if I could get you to give your thoughts on how the study should be evaluating these, how hard should we work to be clearing something, or maybe for Becky, like even if we could clear it, is there a reason to think that we should have a sharing framework anyway, and how you see that playing out?
Sure. Yes, and that's a good follow-up question to some of what Umair just discussed in regard to the PATS process. I mean, I think differing minds can agree on what the goal of that study was, and I think what Umair was referring to in terms of everything wasn't studied is whether the relocation and clearing was possible. DoD at the outset said that will cost hundreds of billions of dollars and take decades. And so I don't think that they saw that as necessarily the purview of the study, but we are where we are now. So I just hope everyone can work together. And like I said, but there was sound technical work. It was a very representative body. The wireless carriers, the cable industry, academia, DoD vendors, they were all part of that process, and everyone had equal opportunity to put technical analysis into that process. So I just hope that part of the process is useful going forward. So now to answer your question about clearing versus sharing, the trade-off is time, money, national security interests, and making spectrum as efficient to as many users as possible. So this is why we have a national spectrum strategy with an implementation plan that's based on science and technical analysis, so we can see what is possible and why it is so important that it is transparent, because I do think there's some distrust of how federal agencies are using spectrum, and the PATS process had both a classified and non-classified component, so that for the first time ever, the commercial interests could actually have some insight into how DoD and federal agencies are using spectrum. And that, I can't underline that enough as to what a big pivot that is and how spectrum policy decisions are made, and how important that is. I do think we need to get away from this mentality of we should always clear when possible, because like I said, it can take a lot of time, and that we were just talking 20 minutes ago about how things aren't necessarily moving fast enough from timeline. So we should be looking at how we can get commercial spectrum into the hands of users as quickly as possible, and sharing and coexistence regimes offer that possibility. Also, let's not forget there is sharing among commercial users too. It's not just about sharing with federal agencies, and the CBRS band is the biggest example of that in the US, and it's provided the opportunity for those who traditionally have not participated in the spectrum access processes in our country through auction, to be able to access spectrum for competitive uses like the cable industry now offering wireless broadband services, but also on oil rigs or at manufacturing sites and educational institutes to provide broadband to students who didn't have access to it before. And a lot of things I think that here in DC we may take for granted.
So, I think that let me pick up on where Becky was at and start with should we be looking at sharing? Should we be looking at clearing? Should we be looking at both? And she mentioned the patch process. Certainly mentioned that the DoD at the outset had said, well, clearing this band would take, I think they said gajillions of dollars or something like that, and 20 plus or so years. That was the incumbent in the band offering those numbers with no backup between them. And the other thing to consider is that they were offering this number as the number to clear 3.1 to 3.45 when that was never really on the table, right? So the real conversation was, what about 3.3 to 3.45, the harmonized portion of that band for 5G? And now you have, General Sherman going back and saying, actually, yeah, in that portion, maybe we can relocate AWACS. Maybe we can relocate their airborne radars. Maybe that is a conversation worth having. That's where we should have been 2 years ago, if that opportunity for sort of that type of engagement was available then. And I think that's the point, is that there is this opportunity there if we're willing to look for it. I don't think the timing really flows in the favor of sharing or coexistence. You look at recently reallocated federal bands like the 3.45 gigahertz band, they happen very fast, within a year or two. I think that's much faster than it would take to develop a dynamic spectrum sharing capability that the federal government would have enough confidence in to use for the military. I think it would be faster, it was faster than the timeline for CBRS and getting that to market as well. And so really, these tried and true methods for reallocating spectrum that have existed for so long, we've got that down to a science, and we can actually implement them pretty quickly. We know how to do that. The FCC is very good at doing that. I think we have to consider also that sharing is never the gold standard, right? If you talk to the federal government, if you talk to the DoD and the military, they want cleared use for their uses as well. It works better. Radar, if you talk to any engineer, you talk to the Lockheed Martin engineers, they'll tell you radar is not a sharing technology. It operates at incredibly high power that makes that very difficult. And so they are, and when I was at the FCC and we would have these conversations with the uniformed services of the DoD, what they would express is skepticism that sharing would work for them as well. What they were willing to do is have some incremental conversation about it, but they're certainly not at a place today where they would say, we're ready to move our military systems to a shared band. I think we're very far away from that point. What's in the strategy about dynamic spectrum sharing is truly a moonshot. It's suggesting, can we come up with an economically viable sharing technology that would allow more users to use the same spectrum without degrading agency capability on one side or quality of service on the other side? And that's very hard to do. And we don't really have a technology or framework that's capable of doing that today. And there's some cautionary tales out there. If you look at, for example, how Wi-Fi shares with radar today in the Uni 3 band, that's proven to be a real cautionary tale. It uses a technology called dynamic frequency selection. And putting that technology into devices increases the cost of the device. What you see today is that Uni 3 band is very underutilized for that reason. There's no predictable access. Users are kicked off and usually reverting back to 2.4 or 5 gigahertz. What you also see is that it caused a big headache for the FCC. They are fielding lots of interference complaints from those Wi-Fi devices to weather radar, Doppler radar, including near airports. It's the only instance that I'm aware of in recent times of the FCC actually clawing back devices that were put into the marketplace because of those interference issues. That's what's at risk if we go too fast on these sorts of things. A lot of those themes are exactly what the NSTAC points out in the letter that they released earlier this month, listing a whole lot of concerns about moving too fast on dynamic spectrum sharing and pointing out all of the challenges we would have to overcome. Things like economic viability and increased costs for devices, lack of predictable access. and making sure that you're not interfering with uses and having to retroactively bring those devices back. I think for NTIA, what its purpose should be is to study how we can make the most amount of spectrum available to use at the highest power possible. I think then it should go to the FCC to determine what's the best way to bring that to the marketplace. That's, I think, how the spectrum study should be done going forward.
I could just take a minute to offer a differing perspective on some of what Umair said.
Yeah, let's do a brief rebuttal, and then I want to bring Jamie back in as well. So
sure. Yeah. Yes, I'll try to be very brief. So in terms of 3.45, yes, the FCC did relocate and worked obviously with the federal partners to relocate that band, but that's why now 3.1 to 3.45 is even more crowded. So I don't think that you can use the speed there as a comparison to what would happen in 3.1. Also, I would beg to differ that we don't have technology available that enables sharing. I mean, we do have sharing in CBRS. There's sharing among commercial users in the 6 gigahertz band using something called an automated frequency coordinator. We do have technologies available. And yes, the goal of the implementation plan is to further those technologies, but that is the goal of everybody in the wireless sector. I mean, we've gone from 2G to 3G to 4G to 5G. Now we're talking about 6G. I mean, to say that a technology isn't the best that it could be, you could say that about any technology. And we should be shooting for the moon in what we do in spectrum policy and wireless communications. Yeah,
speaking of shooting for the moon, I want to go to Jamie because obviously Amazon also has a satellite project Kuiper. And so spectrum sharing in the satellite context means something a little different. I wonder if you could sort of give us an overview of what Kuiper's up to here and what sharing means in that context.
Yes, absolutely. And Becky, I don't think we could have planned a more perfect segue there. Yeah, we're really excited at Amazon to be deploying this, and we're investing significantly, of course, to deploy this low Earth orbit satellite broadband project to connect, hopefully bring affordable, reliable, high quality connectivity to customers and communities, both here in the US and around the world. In terms of spectrum sharing, even though I think this is often misunderstood, even though satellite providers are licensed, are essentially licensees, it's essentially another form of shared spectrum with multiple providers using the same bands and based on the way they operate. It's certainly not exclusive licensed spectrum in the way that terrestrial licenses can be. Coexistence in satellite spectrum is necessary, much like in the shared spectrum models, the terrestrial models we've discussed, like CBRS. There are different levels of priority and different coexistence mechanisms involving things like gateway, where we put gateway locations and power levels. So again, not necessarily dissimilar up in space. As investment and deployment grow, so of course will the need for additional spectrum to enable these new services as well, and of course the right spectrum policies that foster innovation and growth, and of course competitiveness.
Yeah, and I think given that shared environment, how do you think about this balance of promoting competition and innovation from new satellite systems and then also protecting the incumbent systems?
Yes, well, we do a lot of thinking about it as our FCC engagement and filings on this, and of course also activity at the international level. I think it's important to make sure that the sharing rules aren't overly protective. Otherwise, it is an unnecessary constraint on competition and innovation, and of course hinders these new systems from deploying. We really appreciate the FCC's recent work in clarifying the rules governing spectrum sharing among LEO satellite providers with its order last year, but there are still several issues that are unresolved. For example, the way you measure interference between systems in different processing rounds. There are also operational measures that can be undertaken to help improve spectrum sharing, things that all licensees can be doing to share better. For example, information sharing. If a later round system, which of course has the duty to protect earlier round systems, don't know where specific satellites are operating or pointing their beams, you have to assume they're operating everywhere. And so, if there were more transparent information sharing, I think you could unlock a lot of additional capacity. Another area are the international rules governing interference between the older GEO systems and the new LEO systems. This is another big constraint, we think, to unleashing the full capabilities of LEO systems. These rules essentially were developed more than 2 decades ago, long before LEO broadband even existed. And we think they're outdated and overly protect, certain technologies at the expense of innovation. We think we can definitely use spectrum better and serve, millions of new customers with affordable quality broadband, but we need to make sure we have some smart rules to make that happen. So getting the policy right will definitely incentivize operators to design systems that continue to improve how they use and share spectrum.
Yeah, that's great. That's really interesting. It's always the parallel universe of satellite spectrum in all this discussion is always very interesting. We are running short on time, so I want to, as the last question, sort of ask the panelists to do some long-term projections. One of the big goals of the National Spectrum Strategy is to do more long-term planning. And so when I look at the wireless marketplace, it seems like there's a potential for a lot of convergence to be happening. We have the FCC just adopted its supplemental coverage from space rules, where we have satellite companies communicating directly to mobile devices. We have cable companies like Becky's members who are offering wireless services and getting into buying spectrum licenses and that kind of thing. And then mobile companies are offering home broadband, which you normally don't think of that as being a mobile service. And so, how do you see the wire spectrum marketplace playing out in the next decade or so? And how might the National Spectrum Strategy help or hinder that? Easy question.
Sure, I'll answer this in hopefully a way that folks can all agree with. I think the next decade we're going to see continued innovation and rapid technological advancement, the proliferation of all those services that you just mentioned, where the lines are being a little blurred. We're going to have more devices getting online, and they're going to need more capacity and to do it faster. And because of these blurred lines, and talking about satellite and cable companies providing mobile service and mobile companies providing broadband service, at the end of the day, the consumer just wants their technology to work. So I hope to see the implementation plan work in a way that we address all those needs and that we give access to everybody who wants it. And we don't look at things as like black or white or counting megahertz to megahertz, and we look at the end result. And the end result is to get us all online and continue America's competitive and technological advancements.
I think Becky put that perfectly. I will push back on you, Joe, that this is an easy question. I think predicting the future is very, very hard, and I've never quite done it well. I do think the wireless market promises continued growth and innovation at the end of the day. From my perspective, the things I get excited about are wider 5G deployment and adoption, and certainly the rise of private networks as new capabilities like network slicing and others come online, and certainly smarter and more efficient networks as we incorporate new technological advances. All of that means more users, more competition. I think Becky is right. It's too early to say which business model will best support new use cases. The best thing we can do is have an all of the above approach. The best thing we can do is have a predictable pipeline of spectrum to support where the wireless marketplace develops.
Yeah, and I know we're running short on time, but I would just quickly add, building on both what Joe, you said, of course, about the convergence, and then what Becky said about consumers just want, their technology to work wherever they are. I think it's important to just point out that a lot of these technologies are complementary. Of course, they're talked about sometimes in a way that they're competing with each other and it's some zero-sum game, but essentially they're all very important and they work together many times. One example of that is, of course, not only will LEO broadband services like Kuiper bring, affordable connectivity directly to consumers, but they're also partnering with wireless providers to provide, satellite backhaul and help expand, 5G networks into rural areas. We've announced a partnership here with Verizon and other partnerships globally with other carriers. Also, of course, much of wireless traffic, Umair talked about the demands on wireless networks. So a lot of that is offloaded onto Wi-Fi networks. So again, I think a lot of this is complementary and works together. And that's why it's so important to have this, comprehensive strategy that takes a holistic view and looks at the needs of all of these different technologies in the context of our global competitiveness and national security.
Yeah, that's great. I think we are at our time, so I think I'll stop us there. Obviously, so many complicated issues still in the air here. We haven't even talked about Congress's role in all this, or the other parts of the implementation plan about process reforms and workforce programs, so that we can get all those engineers in the room. So stay tuned. I'm sure we'll have many more discussions on all these topics as they unfold. But for now, I'll just say thank you all for joining us, and we look forward to continue to working with all of you.
Thanks,
Thanks
Joe.
so much.
Thank you.